Good morning, Grace and friends. Today's sermon is Salt, Light, and the Deeper Goodness. Today's text operates like an introduction to the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. It is about the deeper goodness or the truer righteousness. Those words, goodness and righteousness, may be a bit tainted today. Mark Twain talked about, in his words, a good man in the worst sense of the word. You may know the type. The little girl prayed, "Dear God, make all the bad people good and make the good people nice." And that word righteousness, it is most often used as in the term self-righteous, a person puffed up with their own goodness, looking down upon others. A holier than thou, better than thou, smarter than thou, woker than thou person. But there is, I think, a kind of goodness we aspire to, which we admire in others and hope for ourselves. Jesus leads us there. The word righteous in the Bible means aligned with God. And the greatest alignment is the alignment of love. Without love, all our attempts at goodness fall flat. Jesus begins by talking about salt and light. We are, he says, salt and light for the world. It is about who we already are and who we are for others and for the world. When salt loses its saltiness, what good is it, Jesus says? Well, some of you who have taken chemistry and studied the periodic tables may say, but salt can't lose its saltness. Sodium is forever. So here Jesus is going all metaphor on us again. Here's his point. Salt is not salt for itself. Salt flavors the world, preserves it, heals it. It's no good, he says, if it stays in the salt shaker. A church that doesn't shake its salt out is like a salt shaker that's gotten all gunky on its lid with the holes stopped up and no salt can get through. The church is not the church, then, for its own sake, but for others. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in prison awaiting his execution by order of Hitler, wrote that the church is only the church when it is a church for others. Barbara Brown Taylor has written that the church is most the church when it is a poured out church. The same with light. We are the light of the world, light for the world. We don't light a lamp and put it under a bushel, Jesus says, but on a stand where it gives light to the whole house. Have you ever noticed how one small candle can light up a darkened room? We don't have to be fireworks to make a difference. So Jesus says, let your light so shine before others that they will see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Good works are an important part of both Jewish and Christian faith. They are how we shine the love and compassion of God on the world. I see you at Grace as every day you are being light through your acts of service and love in the world. You give people hope when they see you. People need to see others who are doing good stuff. Sometimes we grow shy or conflicted about shining our church's light, but it's God's light we are shining. I believe Statesville needs the gospel we try to live out here. God's love for all, period. God's lavish welcome to all, a ministering people. Jesus encourages us in this text to shine our light. We're not saying, look at us, but Look at God. Dean Smith would coach his players at Chapel Hill when they made a basket to point to the player who had made the assist. We do that with the light we shine. We point to God. Near the top of our list of innovative ministries we're working on as a church is the fuller use of social media to show our community who we are and the gospel we're trying to live. Most people today first get to know a church not by visiting on Sunday morning, but through the church's presence on social media. It's one way to shine God's light. We hear about how the early church turned the world upside down in those first 3 centuries and grew from a tiny illegal sect into an empire-wide religion. A key way was how we love people in extravagant and unexpected ways. We set up hospitals for the sick and hostels for weary travelers when traveling was risky. During the plague in Egypt, we cared for the sick and we buried the dead. When others wouldn't touch a person who was sick or dead, we did so at the risk of our own lives. We established welfare programs for the poor. Every Sunday in worship, there was an offering for the poor. We do the same here as we give 20% of our offerings every week to missions, 20% of our annual giving. Let your light so shine. It is the light of love. Now Jesus turns to an important but neglected part of his teaching. He said, I've come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. We're talking about the essential Jewishness of Jesus here. The original sin of the church was anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. It planted the seeds of persecution and forced conversion and pogroms and the Holocaust. And it denied the Jewishness of Jesus. There was an old episode in All in the Family. Archie Bunker is spouting his anti-Jewish bigotry. His son-in-law, whom Archie called Meathead, began to argue, but Archie, he said, Jesus was a Jew. Archie, thrown for a second, paused, then said, yeah, but only on his mother's side. Mainstream New Testament scholarship in the 19th and 20th century played down the Jewishness of Jesus and accentuated the difference between Jesus and the Jews of his time. I swallowed it, and now I know I was wrong. Amy Jill Levine, who is a Jewish scholar and professor of New Testament at Vanderbilt Divinity School, has been among my teachers here. She says rightly that most preachers and scholars have tried to make Jesus look good by making Jews look bad. She's ruined a lot of my former sermons. But Jesus says, I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And then adds, not one iota, not one brush of the pen of scriptures will pass away until it is accomplished. Amy Jill Levine points to how Jesus dressed. Jesus wore fringes. Rabbis then and now wear garments with fringes, 613 tassel-like threads that hang at the end of their garment or stole. There are 613 of them corresponding to the 613 commands of God. Jesus wore fringes. We see it when we read the Gospels. Do you remember the story of the woman who had the issue of blood, who came up behind Jesus and said, if I but touch the fringes of his garment, I will be healed. Fringes, not hem, as we have read it. Jesus wore all 613 commandments. He came not to abolish, but to fulfill. So now let's think about what fulfill means. We could say deeper or make whole or get to the heart of it. Jesus ends his introduction to the Sermon on the Mount by saying, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven." First, in line with what I've just said, we cannot make this anti-Jewish. Jesus was referencing the religious elite of his time who used religion to serve themselves, not God's people. It happens all the time. So we might translate, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the preachers and the deacons, the Bible thumpers and the religious big shots, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. What does this word exceed mean? Is Christianity more than following the rules? More than moral perfectionism? What is this deeper goodness, this truer righteousness Jesus is calling us to? I offer two illustrations I have used before. Yes, I remember I've used them before. The first is from Frederick Buechner as he writes about righteousness. "You haven't got it right," said the exasperated piano teacher. Junior is holding his hands the way he's been told. His fingering is unexceptional. He has memorized the piece perfectly. He has hit all the notes with deadly accuracy. But his heart's not in it, only his fingers. What he's playing is a sort of music, but nothing that will start voices singing or feet tapping. He has succeeded in boring everybody to death, including himself." Buechner goes on, "The scribes and Pharisees were playing it by the book. They didn't slip up on a single do or don't, but they were getting it all wrong. Righteousness is getting it all right. If you play it the way it's supposed to be played, there shouldn't be a still foot in the house." That's the deeper goodness. It's got not just the words, but the music too. And the music is love. You know it when you see it. It's the real thing. The second illustration is from the acclaimed writer Madeleine L'Engle, who wrote A Wrinkle in Time. She writes of being on a ferry boat and watching the birds. First, she watched the pigeons. They would flap their wings against the wind until they finally got to the ferry. Then a gust of wind would come and blow them back again, and then again they began to flap their wings furiously until they got even with the boat again, when inevitably another burst of wind would blow them back. Have you ever felt like a pigeon? Then she watched the seagulls as they sailed almost effortlessly with the wind and on the wind. They glided while the pigeons flapped. Jesus is saying, be seagulls, not pigeons. Sometimes we in our faith try to be super pigeons. The scribes and the Pharisees were super pigeons. But a deeper, truer righteousness and goodness is like the seagull, gliding on and with the wind. It is the wind of the Spirit, which is love. It's all about love. The salt is love because it's poured out for others. The light is love because it shines for others. It is the light of love, and when it shines, it's like that city on a hill that cannot be hid. It is love that fulfills the 613 commandments. It is love that fulfills the prophetic vocation to call the nation back to the ways of God. Love. Think of those whose goodness seems good through and through. It's like they become almost transparent with the love of God. That's the kind of goodness Jesus lived. He came to love the world, not scold it. And that's why we love him. He is the secret to the Sermon on the Mount and to a deeper goodness. Amen.